Okay, so welcome to Rethinking the Stories We Tell. Time to remove gender stereotypes from our textbooks. Education is the moving force, the inspiration, the centerpiece for the socio-cultural, political, emotional, and economic empowerment of individuals. We spend majority of our lifetimes, if we're studying in education at all those different periods, in some form of schoolhouse. Therefore, I'm arguing that the schoolhouse and that time we spend is one of the most important mouthpieces to our societal upbringing, and without a doubt, the foundational leader of our lives, from learning life skills to gender, to relationships and community interactions. Would you guys agree? Okay. So gender, as defined by the World Health Organization, says, gender refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. That includes norms, behaviors, and roles associated with being a man, woman, girl, or boy, as well as relationships with each other. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time. That is a fact, not an opinion. So if we're going off of fact of gender and why we're here, I'd like to say that my name, Fallon Davis, my pronouns are they, them. I discovered this in my 30s, that I was non-binary, which is, can you imagine how difficult it's been for me to really figure out who I was and be proud of who I was, because I wasn't really expressing who I was accurately. I didn't even have the language, the understanding, the mentorship. I didn't have anybody who I could look at and say, oh, that's why I'm so confused, you know? And so it's important when we're talking about education, a place where we're spending majority of our lives, to understand how important equity is when it comes to removing this gender bias. And so I'd ask the same question to my colleagues. Nancy, what's your why?
My name is Nancy Boss. I am a 55-year-old cisgender female using she, her pronouns. I was raised to believe that all people are equal and should be equally respected. And yet that isn't what I experienced in my personal life, and that wasn't what I saw in the culture around me. It's one of my core foundational beliefs, and so it is incredibly important to me in my work to try to respect and treat everyone else equally.
Hi, my name is Chelsea Larsuel, and I use she, her pronouns. My why really comes back to my experience looking back to high school. I went to an all-girls school, and so the type of classroom that I was associated with, used to, looked really different from that next step to college and what it looked like to be in a classroom with other women who identify in various ways, men, those who are non-binary, et cetera, and looking at that experience and how safe and uplifted I felt in that kind of all-girls setting, to move into spaces that just brought upon a different perspective for me and really drove me to wanting to work for an organization, 1000 Dreams Fund, which is really focused on funding and uplifting women across various spaces.
Wonderful, thank you both. So there was a study conducted, one of the largest studies of gender bias in textbook done in the United States. It involved 5,618 children's books published from 1900 to 2000. The authors found general and large-scale underrepresentation of females. The most extreme underrepresentation of females centered characters involved animals, and the least was of female children. What they considered based on the relative absence of animal and human females in children's books to be a form of symbolic annihilation, ignoring or underrepresenting women and girls in cultural products denies their existence. That's a fact. So think about the erasure of cultures who use two-spirit language before time, in animals, in nature, asexual reproduction of our plant species. These are all scientific facts. So are we really using our textbooks to educate, or we're using it to continue a social construct? And so that would be, and a little bit of us to explain the ways that we have done things to eradicate this nuance and this continued miseducation and representation of actually what gender and identity and being is.
I've been in the performing arts for 25 years as a performer, but also as a singing coach and a speaking coach and in theater. And I will say, in many ways, when it comes to expressions of gender diversity, performing arts is doing pretty well, better than most of the rest of the pack, right? In theater, no matter what your gender expression is, odds are very high that the theater director will welcome you into the program. If you're singing in a chorus, if you're in band, the director probably doesn't care what your gender is unless there's too many people in one section. In which case, if there's too many altos, some of those altos might sing tenor. But it's not flawless. And what Fallon just pointed out with the underrepresentation of females, and of course, virtually no representation of other parts of the gender spectrum, is that there is no role for all of the girls that try out for theater. And so you end up having 3 boys try out for 3 parts, they all get it, they all feel like winners, and you have 20 girls try out for 1 female part, and they are pitted against each other. And that's where that backstabbing nastiness that is attributed to the female gender comes from in theater, is competing for the crumbs. And so I would say in theater, we certainly do welcome the fact that many theater companies are starting to allow the idea that different genders, and of course different races, can represent in non-traditional ways on the stage. Grateful for that. In band, again, the director doesn't care if you're a girl or a boy as long as you can play the trumpet. But the trumpet section cares. The trumpet section is going to be almost all boys, and the flute section is going to be almost all girls. And so we're still culturally putting ourselves into those pockets. And then I'm also a publisher. I've written several books on voice. The Singing 101 is without gender. And let me tell you, in the world of singing, we only started to understand that there is no really big physical anatomical difference between males and females. We only started to understand that 20 years ago. Most teachers believed somehow that men have a different kind of larynx that they can do falsetto. And now we understand, no, it's the same larynx, it's just labels that we've put on it over the years. And so in singing, this knowledge that it's the same voice box for everybody, just different variations on size and shape, is new information. So we're still overcoming hundreds of years of pedagogy in singing voice. The book Singing 101 comes from a gender-neutral perspective. But after that, in order to empower women, I wrote the Teen Girls Singing Guide, which is based on the Myers-Briggs personalities and walks the girls through the journey of being a singer. And then Singing Through Change, Women's Voices in Midlife, Menopause, and Beyond, because there had never been a book written about the menopause voice changes and the impact on singing. And we're all singers, and some of us, our voices crash with menopause, and that had never been written about before. So that's where my work is in the performing arts.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think going back to your point about the annihilation of the female character even within these stories, I think that really comes back to the point of this entire presentation today about what stories are we telling in our textbooks. And I think it really does begin as far back as when you are in preschool, and to the point about the animal characters. I was reading a UNESCO study who looked at countries across the world, Korea, Chile, Iran, the United States included, among others. And it talked about, even within these children's stories, when we're looking at the rabbit, when we're looking at the deer, those are always attributed to these female characters. When we're looking at the lions, the tigers, the bears, these are always attributed to the male dominant characters and association generally. And so I think, to your point about where we see this fold into the performing arts, it's sewn into us from such a young age that in many times, until maybe we're in our 30s or much later on, it's not even so conscious.
Right.
All of the subtle but very clear male gaze that our textbooks and not even textbooks, but truly children's books seep into us.
Yes. And for me, I came out early. I came out at 12. But it was, for me, an understanding, it wasn't about who I was having sex with. It was about how I viewed myself in the world, how I wanted to show up, how I wanted to dress. You know, it was like, I don't want to wear that. I'm comfortable in being in this way, and I don't want to do those certain activities. I want to do these other activities. And so I had my understanding of gender for me was that I can be whoever I wanted to be. But that was because I was a type of, I guess, kid who questioned authority and who was like, I'm not fitting into that. I was class president very early on. So I was one of the first people that came out in my town. So I had a very privileged view on what it meant coming out, right? Like, I didn't really have a come out story or thing. I'm like, I just said who I was, and, people looked at my character versus anything else. And I think that that's very important of my journey, because it gave me the courage to be a leader, to be able to be out and proud. And when I was 18, when Macy's told me, I didn't fit into their company culture, I started in fashion. And for me not to see representation in fashion when it's supposed to be queer, because fashion is queer, I knew that it was not representation of who I was and who I wanted to be. So I've always been a person to create my own. And so I started the first Masculine of Center fashion show in the country, in the world. I toured and did fashion shows all over, representing Masculine of Center individuals, educating people on the terms. There's stud, mass, AG, all these different things, but really there's a history behind it. There is a reason why certain groups started with butches, certain groups started with the word dyke. There's a reason why historically these things have evolved and changed. And, it's important when we're talking about the gender, it's a cultural shift that we all have to learn to adapt to. And that also is the change of education, which we know is very stagnant. And for me, the education system really never represented me. It never gave me a culture experience, because it didn't talk about being black either. It didn't tell me my history. I grew up in a predominantly white area, and they taught me about things that they wanted me to see. Never showed me an HBCU. I'm a radical. Come on, I would have loved an HBCU. I did not, care to get into a predominantly white institution, but I thought that was the only place for an honors queer person to go. That's what they told me. So just think about that. This was years ago. This was, I'm in my 30s now, but the kids are coming up, and they need to know that you don't have to feel like you don't exist in this world. And so I created my own organization, STEAM Urban, and we changed education for black and brown students, but we changed it for those of all abilities. So we really cater to, using your humanities, centering emotion as your, most beautiful thing. So you can be angry, you can be sad, you can be frustrated in a learning environment and be accepted and loved on. And creating these new safe spaces that never existed before. And that's how we change education, right?
I'd like to address the language in the textbooks a little bit. And I'd like to address this from the perspective that I'm a middle-aged white woman, and I have written an article coaching choral directors on how to wrap their brains around gender language now and how to be respectful of gender expressions in the choirs. That if you go to my LinkedIn, which is Nancy E. Boss, you'll find that article right at the top. Even though I wrote it 7 years ago, I read it last night, it's still all right. But let me point out that it was hard for my brain to remember to call the person in front of me by their preferred pronouns if it was different from how I felt they were visually presenting themselves. That was challenging. It is in the limbic brain at infancy that we start to label these genders. And so I empathetically say that I understand that this is hard. As a teacher, we're gonna goof up. I've already goofed up once this morning with gender pronouns. And forgiveness, we're all human. This is a new field for many of us. I think it's important to understand that. The other thing I'd like to point out for cisgendered men, this has got to be just as big of a paradigm shift as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. And we understand that. We understand as an entire culture that we are asking for big change that is upsetting and indicates risk. I don't know if that changes anything, but I want you to know that we see and hear that as other genders.
Yeah, but I think, the changing of the language in textbooks, this general shift, it's just as important for people like Fallon who want to be seen themselves in these books and histories represented, but it's just as important for someone on the complete opposite spectrum to hear and see and learn about these stories. That is, we learn through human experience, but that human experience, especially from kindergarten through high school, which is compulsory for across the US, you learn in the classroom. And so whether you go home to the very traditional nuclear family, or you go home and you have two moms, maybe you have one mom, maybe you have a single dad, whatever that might look like for you at home, you're learning there, but you're learning in the classroom. And so it's just as important for someone who doesn't necessarily see themselves, just as important for someone who isn't a person of color to learn about the histories of people of color in these classrooms. And I think that's really the crucial part of shifting the textbook language as we look at it in relation to gender expression and beyond.
Yes. Absolutely. And so we have one final thought as we are thinking about the resolve, right? So what can be done now? Because the times have changed. It's enough to stop saying, I can't do that, I don't know how to do that. You have to figure that out. It's like when someone's name, the importance of name, we do a lot of that, especially, in Black culture, our names are very unique, and a lot of times they don't get respected. And so we teach the importance of correcting folks to get your name right. So that means you have to use what people are asking you to use. It's not your own selfish, ego that's driving someone else's identity. And so in education, we have to let that ego aside if we're really going to teach people to be of the next generation or the future generation. But in 1983, there was a treaty that folks tried to pass. It was the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's the international legal instrument that requires countries to eliminate discrimination against women and girls in all areas and promotes women's and girls' equal rights. 186 of 193 countries ratified that treaty. Do you think the United States is a part of the people who signed the treaty? No. That was from 1983. They've never signed that treaty. So any of those the Sex Discrimination Act, the Disability Discrimination Act, the Human Rights Equal Opportunities Act, the Racial Discrimination Act, will all falter if that treaty isn't signed. That was the reason why those were created. So we're living in a society that's never really accepted anything other than their social construct, which was done in colonization. So if we're going to talk about the evolution of time, the adaptation of time, you have to really tell a real history in that you stole land, you took people's culture and identity for the sake of your own empowerment, which is what we see. The poverty, the lack of access, it's all by design. So you have to know that gender was a part of that. Because what do we see at the beginning? These gender reveal parties. People, it's like a big thing. The color of the clothes. Who made blue and pink? Who gendered color? Hello, we're artists. Like, come on, blue and pink are not the best colors. Like, there's so many, add a little glitter to it, but it's just to think about the nuances. And if we really want to change education, we really have to just think about how, silly a lot of these, stories and things have been, that kept us apart and separated and divided. So that's what I would leave you with. How can you use the history, the facts, and implement that into the reality of equity and change the way that you're speaking to people and the language that you're using?
I think that is the first step, right, is changing your own actions and how you interact with the outside world. But I do think there's a piece you touched on, which is the general buy-in, the government buy-in, the systematic buy-in, which is, I think, where we maybe most lack. I think, there are a lot of kids today who are in a world where they do fully understand differences in gender expression. And are embraced in a lot of places for that matter. But I do think that systematic buy-in is the piece that is, in pretty much all cases, always the slowest moving piece of that. Right. And so talking about this unsigned treaty, but even at, when we're speaking about education, it's important to really look at it at a state level and even come down, to a more micro level, even at the city, or because these are the people and the spaces that will make those changes. Your mayors, the city council members, those types of people, even your state representatives, those are the people to speak to. Those are the people who are going to make the biggest change. Of course, you want to see this trickle down effect, but we know how well that can work. And I think that buy-in, again, from that state or local level, especially as it relates to what textbooks are we putting in. I mean, we can see that on the converse side when we're talking about the book bans happening in some parts of the country, right? We can see the effect that a state can have on what our children learn. And so as educators ourselves, as just constituents of whatever city, town you come from, it's important to put the pressure on those local leaders to change, again, this general paradigm shift, so that when your kids go to the library, when your kids are reading, what are considered the classics in high school and things like that, we're considering gender and gender expression in those. Classics are classics for a reason, of course, but it's important that we refresh and update and move those along with us. And I think that is probably the slowest moving part as we talk about this. The resources are out there. We live in a Google world. I'm worried about this part. Anyone really could learn. Puzzle box. It's just a matter of being able to shift that into this larger systematic pool. And I think that really is the question of where and how do we do that?
I love your gentle approach, and that isn't mine. I'm glad we're different that way, but I see a war on gender. I live in New Mexico. I've always chosen to live in places where gender is, fluidity even is respected. I live in New Mexico right next to Texas, where the legal system has a war on women. It's documentable. And it blows my mind that this is happening. Like, wait, what? We're going the other direction. Well, of course, that's why it's happening, right? It's because we're going the other direction, so there's going to be pushback. We have to keep pushing forward, push. And when you find a textbook that is underrepresenting anybody other than men and European-based men, write that publisher and write that author. If anybody ever wrote me a letter to StudioBos Publishing and says, you got this wrong, you're underrepresenting, I would be fixing it and putting out apologies just like that. Write the authors. Push back, push back, push back. Because we have to keep this moving forward despite the political war and the religious war on the gender understanding and respect.
And we have to make it accessible to children. We just did a program in New Jersey, and I'm not sure if you know about the towns in New Jersey, but so we're from Newark, New Jersey. It's the largest city in New Jersey, and it has the largest separation of socioeconomic. So it's a lot of black and brown folks in poverty. And then there's our surrounding areas, which are more affluent or have more access to resources. And so we just did a program in Montclair, New Jersey, where they asked us to do a residency, a social justice residency, and the students in 4th grade were very aware of their pronouns, how they identify, and they were able in that school to express themselves because the school was using a social justice framework. And so even when I developed STEAM Urban, I developed it based on STEAM for educational justice. If we're going to create anything new, it needs to combat and eliminate the things that are existing now. And so with making the information accessible to children, you give them an option to choose what they want to do when they grow up. We're not forcing people to be people who they don't want to be. And we're ending up with a lot of unhappy adults. So if we start with our younger generation and really understand and see that historically it hasn't gotten better, so that something's got to change. Our young people are the ones that are really are going to live with what the decisions we make today. And so if you're not doing something for the young people, you're not really doing anything, especially in education. And so that would be my, biggest takeaway from this, is that you have to be part of the change. I'm a, walking, talking representation of what I believe in, and though I advocate for other people's rights too. I'm a pro-woman rights advocate, I'm a pro, workers' rights and labor rights, environmental justice rights. I do a lot of rights making, because if it's not equal for everybody, it's not equitable for everybody, then it's not equitable for any of us. And until we realize we're part of that problem, we really can't make a difference.